أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ياسين والقرآن الحكيم إنك لمن المرسلين على صراط مستقيم تنزيل العزيز الرحيم لتنذر قوما ما أنذر آباؤهم فهم غافلون لقد حق القول على أكثرهم فهم لا يؤمنون إنا جعلنا في أعناقهم أغلالا فهي إلى الأذقان فهم مقمحون وجعلنا من بين أيديهم سدا ومن خلفهم سدا فغشيناهم فهم لا يبصرون وسواء عليهم أنذرتهم أم لم تنذرهم لا يؤمنون إنما تنذر من اتبع الذكر وخشي الرحمن بالغيب فبشره بمغفرة وأجر كريم إنا نحن نحيي الموتى ونكتب ما قدموا وآثارهم وكل شيء أحصيناه في إمام مبين واضرب لهم مثلا أصحاب القرية إذ جاءها المرسلون إذ أرسلنا إليهم اثنين فكذبوهما فعززنا بثالث فقالوا إنا إليكم مرسلون قالوا ما أنتم إلا بشر مثلنا وما أنزل الرحمن من شيء إن أنتم إلا تكذبون قالوا ربنا يعلم إنا إليكم لمرسلون وما علينا إلا البلاغ المبين قالوا إنا تطيرنا بكم لئن لم تنتهوا لنرجمنكم وليمسنكم منا عذاب أليم قالوا طائركم معكم أن ذكرتم بل أنتم قوم مسرفون وجاء من أقصى المدينة رجل يسعى قال يا قوم اتبعوا المرسلين اتبعوا من لا يسألكم أجرا وهم مهتدون وما لي لا أعبد الذي فطرني وإليه ترجعون أتخذ من دونه آلهة إن يردني الرحمن بضر لا تغني عني شفاعتهم شيئا ولا ينقذون إني إذا لفي ضلال مبين إني آمنت بربكم فاسمعون قيل ادخل الجنة قال يا ليت قومي يعلمون بما غفر لي ربي وجعلني من المكرمين وما أنزلنا على قومه من بعده من جند من السماء وما كنا منزلين واحدة فإذا هم خامدون يا حسرة على العباد ما يأتيهم من رسول إلا كانوا به يستهزئون ألم يروا كم أهلكنا قبلهم من القرون أنهم إليهم لا يرجعون وإن كل لما جميع لدينا محضرون وآية لهم الأرض الميتة أحييناها واخرجنا منها حبا فمنه يأكلون وجعلنا فيها جنات من نخيل وأناب وفجرنا فيها من العيون ليأكلوا من ثمره وما عملته أيديهم أفلا يشكرون سبحان الذي خلق الأزواج كلها مما تنبت الأرض ومن أنفسهم ومما لا يعلمون وآية لهم الليل نسلخ منه النهار فإذا هم مظلمون والشمس تجري لمستقر لها ذلك تقدير العزيز العليم والقمر قدرناه منازل حتى عاد كالأرجون القديم لا الشمس ينبغي لها أن تدرك القمر ولا الليل سابق النهار وكل في فلك يسبحون وآية لهم أنا حملنا ذريتهم في الفلك المشحون وخلقنا لهم من مثله ما يركبون وإن نشأ نغرقهم فلا صريخ لهم ولا هم ينقذون إلا رحمة منا ومتاعا إلى حين وإذا قيل لهم اتقوا ما بين أيديكم وما خلفكم لعلكم ترحمون وما أنفقوا مما رزقكم الله قال الذين كفروا للذين آمنوا أنطعم من لو يشاء الله وطعمه إن أنتم إلا في ضلال مبين ويقولون متى هذا الوعد إن كنتم صادقين ما ينظرون إلا صيحة واحدة تأخذهم وهم يخصمون فلا يستطيعون توصية ولا إلى أهلهم يرجعون ونفخ في السور فإذا هم من الأجداث إلى ربهم ينسلون قالوا يا ويلنا من بعثنا من مرقدنا هذا ما وعد الرحمن وصدق المرسلون شيئا ولا تجزون إلا ما كنتم تعملون إن أصحاب الجنة اليوم في شغل فاكهون هم وأزواجهم في ظلال على الأرائك متكئون لهم فيها فاكهة ولهم ما يدعون سلام قولا من رب رحيم وامتازوا اليوم أيها المجرمون ألم أهد إليكم يا بني آدم ألا تعبدوا الشيطان إنه لكم عدو مبين وأن اعبدوني هذا صراط مستقيم كنتم تكفرون اليوم نختم على أفواههم وتكلمنا أيديهم وتشهد أرجلهم بما كانوا يكسبون ولو نشاء لطمسنا على أعينهم فاستبقوا الصراط فأنى يبصرون ولو نشاء لمسخناهم على مكانتهم فما استطاعوا مزيا ولا يرجعون ومن نؤمره ننكسه في الخلق أفلا يأكلون وما علمناه الشعر وما ينبغي له إن هو إلا ذكر وقرآن مبين لينذر من كان حيا ويهك الكون على الكافرين أولم يروا أنا خلقنا لهم مما عملت أيدينا أنعاما فهم لها مالكون وذللناها لهم فمنها ركوبهم ومنها يأكلون ولهم فيها منافع ومشارب أفلا يشكرون واتخذوا من دون الله آلهة لعلهم ينصرون لا يستطيعون نصرهم وهم لهم جند محضرون فلا يحزنك قولهم إن نعلم ما يسرون وما يعلنون أولم ير الإنسان أنا خلقناه من نطفة فإذا هو خصيم مبين وضرب لنا مثلا ونسي خلقا قال من يحيي العظام وهي رميم قل يحييها الذي أنشأها أول مرة وهو بكل خلق عليم الذي جعل لكم من الشجر الأخضر نارا فإذا أنتم منه توقدون أوليس الذي خلق السماوات والأرض بقادر ألا أن يخلق مثلهم بلى وهو الخلاق العليم إنما أمره إذا أراد شيئا أن يقول له كن فيكون فسبحان الذي بيده ملكوت كل شيء وإليه ترجعون صدق الله العلي العظيم اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد سورة المباركة الفاتحة
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. ہائے عباس میرے، ہائے علمدار میرے، چل گئی بازو تیرے قلب پہ تلوار میرے، ہائے عباس میرے، بوند پانی کے لیے ہاتھ کٹانے والے، پیاس بجھانے والے، کس لیے سو گیا تو نہر پہ غم خوار میرے، ہائے عباس میرے، تیرے دم سے میرے لشکر کا بھرم باقی تھا، اے علمدار تیرے ساتھ علم باقی تھا، کر دیا تنہا مجھے تو نے مددگار میرے، ہائے عباس میرے، جھک گئی میری کمر، پھٹ گیا سینہ میرا، جس گھڑی کٹ کے گرے فرات پہ بازو تیرا، سینکڑوں تیر چلے جیسے ہوئے سار میرے، ہائے عباس میرے، بہایا اس وقت مشق کے ساتھ جگر، کر لیا زخمی اپنا تیرے قربان میرے، ہائے عباس میرے، ٹھوکر کھاتے ہیں آنکھوں میں بصارت نہ رہی، رہ گئی بات تمہارے میرے دل میں حسرت، کہہ کے مجھ کو نہ پکارا کبھی بھائی بھائی، ہائے عباس میرے، کبھی مولا کبھی آقا کبھی سرور کے سوا، اور کوئی بات زباں پر نہیں آئی بھائی، ہو گئی اب میرے لشکر کی صفائی بھائی، ہائے علمدار میرے، خالی کوزوں میں بھرے بچوں نے آنسو اپنے، کہتی ہے بالی سکینہ کوئی فریاد سنے، لے گیا چھین
Wherever my sound is reaching, please recite Allah salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali. Abbas, Abbas, Ya Abul Fazl Abbas. Abbas, Abbas, Ya Abul Fazl Abbas. Sakaye haram rakh le na bharam, hum dar pe tumhare aaye hain. سکائے حرم رکھ لے نہ بھرم، ہم در پہ تمہارے آئے ہیں. تم بھی نہیں ہم کو ٹھکرانا، تم بھی نہیں ہم کو ٹھکرانا، ہم دنیا کے ٹھکرائے ہیں. عباس عباس یا ابوالفضل عباس، اب سارے سہارے ٹوٹ چکے، ہمیں اپنے پرائے لوٹ چکے. اب سارے سہارے ٹوٹ چکے، ہمیں اپنے پرائے لوٹ چکے. تم اپنی پناہوں میں لے لو، تم اپنی پناہوں میں لے لو، ہم غم کے بہت گھبرائے ہیں. عباس عباس یا ابوالفضل عباس، اشکوں کی زبان پہچانتے ہو، جو دل میں ہے وہ جانتے ہو. اشکوں کی زبان پہچانتے ہو، جو دل میں ہے وہ جانتے ہو. ہم کہہ نہیں سکتے تم کو پھیلائے ہیں. عباس عباس یا ابو الفضل العباس مولا 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 تم باب ہوائج ہو روزے پہ ہمیں بھی بلوا لو مولا تم باب ہوائج ہو روزے پہ ہمیں بھی بلوا لو غربت کے سبب جو غربت آ نہ سکا ہم سب کے عریضے بھیجتے ہیں عباس عباس یا ابو الفضل عباس کھا کھا کے تماچے روتی ہے زندہ کی خاک پہ سوتی ہے کھا کھا کے تماچے روتی ہے زندہ کی خاک پہ سوتی ہے بجھ جائے پیاس سکینہ کی ہم آنکھ میں آنسو لائے ہیں عباس عباس یا ابو الفضل العباس عباس عباس یا ابو الفضل العباس صلوات میرے غازی کہاں ہو میرے غازی کہاں ہو تیری جاگیر سے چل پڑا قافلہ میرے غازی کہاں با وفا ہے بہن بیردا میرے غازی کہاں ہو تجھ کو دیکھے بنا چین آتا نہیں نوک نیزہ پہ سے تیرا ملتا نہیں میں زیارت کروں کس طرح تو بتا میرے غازی کہاں ہو تیرے بازو مجھے راستے میں ملے میں نے چاہے پر رکھے بازوؤں سے تیرا پوچھتی ہوں پتا میرے غازی کہاں ہو تیری جاگیر سے چل پڑا قافلہ میرے غازی کہاں ہو میں نے بچپن میں لوری سنائی تجھے میں نے چلنا سکھایا تھا بھائی تجھے راہ پر خار پر مجھ کو چلنا سکھا، میرے غازی کہاں ہو، وہ تیری لاڈلی وہ سکینہ تیری، چلتے نا کیس جب خاک پر گر گئی، دیکھتی رہ گئی وہ سوئے کماں، میرے غازی کہاں ہو، تیری جاگیر سے تیری جاگیر سے چل پڑا قافلہ، میرے غازی کہاں ہو، میرے غازی کہاں ہو، صلوات علی محمد وآل محمد، اللہم صلی علی آل محمد وعجل فرج. Let us recite the ayah of Amma Yujibu times for all those who may be facing any kinds of hardship, whether it be war, whether it be health, whether it be financial. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. All together. أما يجيب المضطر إذا دعا ويكشف سوء، 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 أما يجيب المضطر إذا دعا ويكشف سوء. صلوات على محمد وآل محمد.
وآل محمد. رحم الله من قرأ سورة المباركة الفاتحة. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم، الحمد لله رب العالمين، الرحمن الرحيم، مالك الدين، إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين، اهدنا الصراط المستقيم، صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم، قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم، بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. فوضوا أمري إلى الله إن الله بصير بالعباد، ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. حسبنا الله ونعم الوكيل ونعم المولى ونعم النصير. والصلاة والسلام والتحية والإكرام على الرسول المسدد المصطفى الأمجد المحمود الأحمد، الذي سمي في السماء بأحمد وفي الأرض بأبي القاسم محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين المنتجبين، الذين أذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. وقل رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. أما بعد قال الله تبارك وتعالى في كتاب الكريم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والشعراء يتبعهم الغاوون ألم تر أنهم في كل واد يحيمون وأنهم يقولون ما لا يفعلون إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وذكر الله كثيرا وانتصروا من بعد ما ظلموا وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون. صدق الله العلي العظيم. زينوا مجالسكم بالصلوات على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. My respected elders, brothers and sisters in Iman, in Allentown, across the United States, across the United Kingdom, and across the world, wherever you may be, Salamun alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Question: what is the power of poetry? We've been discussing the concept of a worldview. That is, with which lens do I analyze the world? That is, for example, I look at the world from the lens of, for example, the lens of capitalism, or for example, materialism, or for example, X and Y. And we came to this conclusion that there may be different lenses with which I look at the world. That is, the lenses, the glasses with which I observe the world, it may be comprised of different viewpoints. And although those individual viewpoints may not be a problem in and of themselves, they may solve a particular problem. But we gave the example of the elephant and the blind man, and we gave the example of, for example, you can expand that to a car or a vehicle or whatever choice you have, that, for example, that particular ism, whether it's capitalism or otherwise, it's like the tire of the car, or it is like the foot of the elephant in the example that we gave in the past. But it is not the entire vehicle, it's not the entire picture. The entire picture is a God-centric reality, a reality that Islam puts forward of a God-centric universe. Therefore, in understanding a worldview and cultivating a worldview, we first went through the layers of trying to understand how our worldview is developed. And we gave the example that for the last 200 years, for the Muslim communities across the globe, that worldview has been cultured and fostered, not necessarily by the community itself. It's actually been fostered since the Renaissance to the Enlightenment in 1800s. It has been fostering that mindset, and that has been cultivating our views. Now, when we come to this question, we're getting into a terrain about culture and Islam. This is a terrain that many people ask this question. What does Islam say about culture? Is this all cultural? We should get rid of all of these things? Or I want pure Islam. I want everything out of it, and I just want culture. These issues require some more intricacy. They require some more intricacy. They require more detail. They require more nuance. What do I mean? We many times are very gray in many things. That is, truth and falsehood, you may say, black and white, in the sense that it's clear that you don't, for example, you don't lie, you tell the truth, you do all of these things. But with respect to certain other elements of the equation, there are certain things that require more depth. One of them is the relationship of poetry and Islam. Because many people ask this question and they have it in the back of their minds, whether they ask it or not, especially in nights like this. And when we come to the commemoration of Sayyid al-Shuhada, people ask the question, there is a marsiya before, there is a salam before, there is a nawha or a latam afterwards. And on the way here, on the drive in the car, many people may be listening to nawhas or latams or poetry in honor of the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. And even on the drive home, on the way home, you may be listening to nawhas and latams and marsiyas and salams in your vehicle. Poetry that laments the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam and revives their memory. The question that comes to the mind is this something that is Islamic or not? And if it is Islamic, to what extent is it Islamic? And if it's not Islamic, then why is it there in the first place? This is something that we must understand. Therefore, tonight, our conversation is surrounding poetry and Islam, the station of it, does it have any reverence or not? And why this is so vital to the future of our community, and what role has the poetry played throughout the era and throughout the times, so that we can understand very clearly if this is a figment of culture, what was the stand of the Quran on this issue, what was the stand of the Ahlul Bayt on this issue, what was the stand of the scholars on this issue. To understand this concept, I would like to look at it in the following ways. Number one, I would like to look at the power of poetry and what have philosophers throughout history said about the station of poetry. I would then like to look at some science about what is the power of poetry. Does it have any power? And if so, what is that power? I want to look at comparative religions. I want to look at some other faiths on this planet and other religions on this planet, and what has been their relationship with poetry. Hinduism, Christianity, and other faiths on this planet. What was their relationship with poetry? Did they decry it, or did they get rid of it, or did they utilize it? The next level of analysis is going to be Islam and poetry. What's the clear position of the Quran on this issue? And finally, we'll delve into the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam in their era, period by period. And finally, we'll get to the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam leading up to the plains of Karbala and how poetry was used in that vehicle. And ultimately, on the final return to Medina as well. This is our stages of analysis, inshallah. Wherever you are, here in Allentown, across the globe, from the bottom of your heart, wherever my voice is reaching, send a salawat on Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. We said very clearly that there are certain elements, that there are calls that are going on in our world about, for example, let's get rid of culture altogether. Those individuals who say that this is all cultural, this is religious, this is cultural, it is as if sometimes when people say these arguments, they think that it is something that is very straightforward, very black and white. You realize that there has been an intricate intertwining of culture and religion throughout times. That is something that we will explore in subsequent nights. Tonight, I want to discuss an element of that equation, which is the relationship of poetry and Islam, and how each individual here and the next generation have a vital and a critical role to play with respect to this discussion. Number one, Iqbal, the very famous poet in the subcontinent who is known as Allama Iqbal, and in the Persian Gulf, he is known as Iqbal Lahori because he wrote extensively in Farsi as well as in Urdu. This poet, whose vision, they say, became Pakistan and other nations, it was a visionary on many levels. He says, with respect to the relationship of poetry and the station of, for example, humanity and reality, he says that when truth is not burning, it is philosophy. When truth is not burning, you see this fire, these beautiful flames that are burning around us, that give us this ambiance. This, when something is not burning, but it's the truth, it's haqq, that is philosophy. This is what Iqbal says. He says, but when the truth catches fire, it becomes poetry. You know, that thing that you say that comes from the heart, and it's the truth, it becomes poetry, and the pen begins to write it and capture it. That's the idea. Dil se jo baat nikalti hai, asar rakhti hai. Par nahi taqat parwaz magar rakhti hai. Iqbal himself says that the thing that you say from the bottom of your heart, that when it comes out, when you say it, it doesn't have wings, but it has the ability to fly. That's the power of the truth that emanates from the heart. That's the philosophy. But the philosophy, when it burns, it becomes poetry. Further than this, you look at Aristotle, the three great philosophers of the Greek era. You have Socrates, you have Plato, you have Aristotle. Aristotle said that poetry is greater than history. Now, history, if you recall, the wasiyah of Amir al-Mu'mineen to his son, he says, my son, study the pages of history. Why? Of course, Amir al-Mu'mineen is telling us, of course, as you can imagine, he doesn't need to tell Imam Hassan alayhi salam or Muhammad Hanafiya, there's a debate. I'll leave that to a side. He says, my son, study history. Why? Because I studied the pages of history, and although I did not live as long as some other people in history, I was able to derive, I was able to glean, I was able to take from there the treasure of what brought them good and what brought them harm. And although I didn't live long as some of them, I was able to derive and I was able to extract what brought them harm and what brought them good. Amir al-Mu'mineen is telling us study history. What is Aristotle saying? Aristotle is saying that true with respect to philosophy and poetry, he says poetry is greater than philosophy. Why, Aristotle? He says because philosophy deals with aspects which are history, deals with the specific. When we talk about history, he's saying history and poetry. Poetry is more exalted than history. Why? Because history talks about a specific era, a specific time. It talks about Napoleon in France, particular time, particular space. It talks about, for example, the Magna Carta, and it talks about King John, 1200s. It talks about a specific era and specific time. But poetry has a power to encapsulate and to bring together the universal message. When someone reads it, when someone understands it, it is as true as it may be. If it's truth, it's as true as it is in China, it's as true as in America, it's a true universally. So Aristotle made this argument. You see, there was a study conducted in the United Kingdom at the University of Bangor, or Bangor University. And they wanted to see, is there some power of poetry that people may not realize at a neurological level, at the level of the mind? And when they wanted to study this, what they did was they took some lines of Welsh poetry. When they took from Wales, they took this poetry and they attached EEG measurements onto the heads of the people they were studying. You know, these, when they study the mind, they put all of these types of devices in order to analyze the neural activity, the activity of the mind. When they put this on top of the head of the individuals in the subject, they began to ask them to read this poetry, this lines of poetry. They didn't tell them it was poetry. So one line or one page, for example, looked like one way, they read another page. Underlying it was meter in one of them. In page A was normal, it was prose. In page B, there was rhythm and there was meter, that is poetry. So when they read page A, they said it's interesting. They read page B, and then they asked them, the researchers asked them, which one is better to you? Now, they didn't know it was poetry because they didn't know the language. That wasn't their language, the people who were analyzing this. The psychologists wanted to see what is their response, number one. Number two, they wanted to see what was going on in the head, in the mind. They found that everyone in the study said B is better, although they didn't know it was poetry. But the underlying meter, their mind told them was better. But then they analyzed the brain activity. You know, at the end of the line, at the end of the line of poetry, there is something which we call the punch line. That punch line, or in Arabic and Urdu and Farsi, it's called the bait. You know, that line is the main line that gives you the punch line of the poetry. The researchers found that when that punch line hits, what ends up happening is there's an explosion of neural activity in the brain. You see that when we look at understanding the brain, you see that God had already said in the ancient books, the Abrahamic faith or in Islam, that there's some power here that you may realize or may not. But we'll come to what Islam says on this issue. Before we go further, I want to look at what have some other faiths said. For example, if you go to comparative religions and analyze them, you will find that in Hinduism, for example, they have a book within the Vedas and within their scriptures, which is called the Itihasa. If you go back to the ancient Greeks and the likes, they had, for example, the Odyssey and Homer and these poems. Also in Hindu scripture, you will find over 5,000 years ago, they had, for example, Itihasa. Itihasa is the Sanskrit word for history. It was an epic eulogy. It was epic poems that described, for example, what was going on with their gods. That's in Hinduism. Of course, we don't adhere to that, but it's an example of the universality of poetry. Further than this, if you go to the Christian Bible, you will find certain segments of the Bible which are, for example, called the poetry or the verses of poetry within, or those books. For example, which ones? For example, the book of Job. The book of Job, Nabi Ayyub, as we would call him, his entire book, that's poetry, in the form of poetry. Ecclesiastes is also in the form of poetry. The Psalms, or the Songs of Solomon, also, for example, in the form of poetry. You will find that the Bible has not only included poetry in it, also it has inspired poetry throughout the eras and the times. Therefore, after looking at these religions, the question now boils down, what is Islam's relationship to this? And this is a topic that wherever I go, many people are confused about this topic, and they have not understood the underlying Islamic concept behind it. And you need to understand, we need to understand this so that we can give a clear vision to the next generations on this issue and on this matter across the seas and across the world, to understand what is Islam's relationship on this matter. Number one, when we come to the Quran al-Majid wal Furqan al-Hamid, the Quran dedicates an entire chapter to the poets. The entire chapter is called Surah Shu'ara. Surah Shu'ara, or the poets, is an entire chapter of the Quran. And at the end, I'm reciting to you verses 24 onwards, 224, 224, 225, 226, 227. That what does the Quran say with respect to them? Now, keep in mind the time and space in which these verses are coming. Why? Because I told you in a previous nights that the Arabs were so proud of their language. They were so proud of their poetry that on the Kaaba they would have, for example, the Sabah Mu'allaqat. That if there was anything that they were proud of, it was their language, their literature, and their adab, and in particular their poetry. What does the Quran al-Majid wal Furqan al-Hamid say? Verse 224, right at the end of Surah Shu'ara. وَالشُّعَرَاء بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وَالشُّعَرَاء يَتَّبِهُمُ الْغَاوُونَ أَلَمْ تَرَ أَنَّهُمْ فِي كُلِّ وَادٍ يَحِمُونَ وَأَنَّهُمْ يَقُولُونَ مَا لَا يَفْعَلُونَ إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ وَذَكَرَوا اللَّهَ كَثِيرًا وَانْتَصَرُوا مِنْ بَعْدِ مَا ظُلِمُوا وَسَيَعْلَمُ الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا أَيَّ مَنْقَلِبٍ يَنْقَلِبُونَ. The Quran al-Majid wal Furqan al-Hamid is telling you and I what? Now, it's very important to note, do not derive any conclusion until we have completed the verses. Otherwise, you can be misled. Someone reads the first few verses that I recited and leaves, you'll miss the picture. Why? Because there's a very important conclusion there. The Quran al-Majid wal-Furqan al-Hamid in Surah Shu'ara, verse 224 says, وَالشُّعَرَى يَتَّبِهُمُ الْغَاوُونَ. That the poets, you know who follows the poets? The ones who follow the poets are the ones who have gone astray. Quran, not me. Quran is saying that the one who has gone astray is the one who's following the poets, or rather, the one who's following the poets has gone astray. وَالشُّعَرَى يَتَّبِهُمُ الْغَاوُونَ أَلَمْ تَرَ أَنَّهُمْ فِي كُلِّ وَادٍ يَحِمُونَ. Quran, that do you not see this poet? He's wandering around in the valley aimlessly, purposely, without purpose, without use. He's going from one valley to another. He's speaking about this, he's speaking about that. No purpose. The Quran is saying. والشعراء يتبعهم الغاوون ألم ترى أنهم في كل واد يحيمون وأنهم يقولون ما لا يفعلون. Quran is continuing. Why do the poets say that which they do not do? That is, that the Quran is saying these poets who write and write and write, why do they say, or why do they write? Allegorically, why do they write that which they do not do themselves? That the Quran is saying that there is a gap, there is a difference between what they are writing and what they are saying. These are the first 3 verses towards the end, but the last verse, the last end, and that's where you need to derive the lessons. But the Quran doesn't stop there. It says, إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ وَذَكَرَ اللَّهَ كَثِيرًا وَانْتَصَرُوا مِنْ بَعْدِ مَا ظُلِمُوا وَسَيَعْلَمُ الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا أَيَّ مَنْقَلِبٍ يَنْقَلِبُونَ. What does Quran say at the end? It says, إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا, except those who believe. إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ, and they do good deeds. إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ وَذَكَرَ اللَّهَ كَثِيرًا, and they say Allah's name in dhikr abundantly. وَانْتَصَرُوا مِنْ بَعْدِ مَا ظُلِمُوا, and they help the one who has been oppressed after they have been oppressed. وَسَيَعْلَمُ الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا أَيَّ مَنْقَلِبٍ يَنْقَلِبُونَ, and Allah will not leave the zalim, He will take revenge on him. The verses that you recite many times after the majlis, you hear these. وَسَيَعْلَمُ الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا أَيَّ مَنْقَلِبٍ يَنْقَلِبُونَ. Therefore, a Quranic principle comes forward here, that the Quran says in a general, with respect to purposeless poetry, with respect to meaningless poetry, with respect to hypocritical poetry, Islam was not in favor of the traditional poetry of the Arabs that was meaningless, purposeless, and hypocritical in nature. But Islam said one thing, hold on a second. It's not all across the board. There's very important exceptions here. What are those exceptions? Except those who believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and they do good actions and they take Allah's name in kathrat, in a lot. They take Allah's name and they defend the person who has been oppressed. I ask you, with your hand on your heart, when we recite these, the purpose, this Qabila, that is this tribe, the followers of the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, that purpose of the lamentation of Sayyid al-Shuhada, or raising his merits, or Amir al-Mu'mineen, it all falls in that category of defending the one who has been oppressed. You see, that's where it lies, in the Quranic wisdom. You see, is the Quran a book of poetry? Is it a book of prose? There are two dynamics. You see, language is something that is so powerful. Why? Language is what is one of the things that Allah gave us this ability to think at a higher level compared to animals and other creation. And one of the ways that we manifest this intellect is through language, through the ability to communicate with other people. This ability to communicate with other people makes us humans and allows us to communicate. In communication, there's prose and there's poetry. What is the Quran? Marmaduke Pickthall, or Muhammad Marmaduke Pickthall, the Christian writer who converted to Islam after reading the Quran. He was an expert in the Arabic language. He said, neither poetry nor prose, but a unique fusion of the two. That's the power of the Quran. That's what happened because the Arabs had so much pride in their language that Sa'sa goes to the Kaaba, as I told you the other night, that he goes to the Kaaba. He would never come out of his house until 1 year and one festival a year where he would share his poetry. He goes and he sees the Sab'a Mu'allaqat, but he also sees one verse of the Quran, one chapter of the Quran there. He says and he reads it and he reads the Sab'a Mu'allaqat. He says, I'm familiar with these, but then he begins to read the Quran. He doesn't know about the Quran even. He says, Ma hadha kalamul bashar. This is not the words of an ordinary human being. The Quran itself gives an open challenge. It says that this book, if you doubt it, bring one verse like it. An open challenge till this day. No one's able to do it. No one's able to blend poetry. No one's able to blend prose the way the Quran al-Majid wal Furqan al-Hamid does. But there's another clarification that needs to be made. Because the Quran says, وَمَا أَلَّمْنَاهُ الشَّعْرَ وَمَا يَنْبَغِي لَهُ إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا ذِكْرٌ وَقُرْآنٌ مُبِينٌ. Referring to who? Referring to Rasul al-Azam, the Holy Prophet. The Quran says, وَمَا أَلَّمْنَاهُ الشَّعْرَ. We did not teach him, Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, we did not teach him poetry. Anything that he says, وَمَا أَلَّمْنَاهُ الشَّعْرَ وَمَا يَنْبَغِي لَهُ إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا ذِكْرٌ وَقُرْآنٌ مُبِينٌ. Anything Muhammad says is either zikr or it is the Quran. Why? Because if Allah had taught Rasul al-Azam, the Holy Prophet, poetry, then the Arabs would say, this is just poetry. He's a poet who's just shared a few verses. That's why the divine wisdom was there, not to have Rasulullah be a poet. Although, when we come to the traditions, we'll have clarity with respect to what was the position of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam on this matter. When we come to the time of Rasulullah, the Holy Prophet, there was a man by the name of Hassan bin Sabit. Hassan bin Sabit was considered the poet of the court of Rasulullah. He was that individual that Rasulullah, at very famous times, very important times, he would stand and he would recite poetry. Rasulullah himself says to Hassan, he says, Hassan, that your pen, Hassan bin Sabit, your pen is blessed and your words are selected by the angels. That is, you have blessed writings that you write for us, for the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. However, he says, as long as you continue to write for us, then your pen is blessed. History tells us that after Rasulullah departed this world physically, Hassan began to write for certain people who are not to be necessarily praised. We'll leave that for another day. Nonetheless, when we go further in time, that's the era and that's a period of Rasulullah. But before Rasulullah, this is very... There's a debate about whether our or not, some people say in the Muslim world, it caught fire and it came out in these words. And he came forward and says that one, was he not the first to pray to your Qibla? He's pointing to the Muslims, pointing to Ali ibn Abi Talib on one side. That Ali, is he not the first one to pray to your Qibla? Was he not the foremost in the Quran and the Sunnah? He's giving them a challenge. You know he's the first person who was praying with Rasulullah. And you know that he's the one who knows the most about the Quran and the Sunnah. And yet you took his right. He defended, at that moment in time, he defended Amir al-Mu'mineen. Those lines of poetry, they give a certain power. I tell you from my own experience, what we do as lecturers in 1 hour or 45 minutes, I won't take 1 hour of your time tonight, but at that point, whatever we do in a 45-minute lecture or whatever, a poet and a poem is able to do in 2 lines. It's able to encapsulate the power of what's being said. I can give you a lecture on Karbala, and that must continue, and the Masaib and all of these things must be continued, so we can explain the history, so we can explain what happened. And I can tell you all of these things, or I can tell you 2 lines of poetry that encapsulates everything. I can say, Beti Ali ki turbate Zahra pe aayi hai, kurta lahu bhara hua bhai kalai hai. These 2 lines will encapsulate all of Karbala. That the daughter of Ali has come onto the grave of Fatima Zahra and she's brought the cloth of her brother. How much depth is there? That those people, then I heard the voices, their ears heard it and they saw the entire picture of Karbala, from Medina to Karbala to Kufa to Sham and back. That's the power of poetry. The question we need to ask is, are we cultivating this in the next generation? Are we encouraging people to write the same way that people wrote in honor of Ahlul Bayt in the Arab Gulf, in, for example, Persia, in India, in Gujarati, and all these other language? We'll come to that in a moment. Further than this, Imam al-Hussein himself and Sayyida Zainab, they recited poetry throughout their journey from Karbala all the way through, all the way back to Medina even, and I'll share those with you in a moment. They were reciting poetry. We go to the time of the 4th Imam. The 4th Imam's poet, the poet of the time of the 4th Imam, is by the name of Farazdaq. Farazdaq, the very famous poet, where the ruler comes and he's trying to get to Hajar al-Aswad and no one gives him space. And then Imam Sajjad emerges, everyone splits. He goes straight to Hajar al-Aswad. Farazdaq standing there. They ask the tyrant ruler, the zalim ruler. He says, that who is this person? The crowd, as in saying, the crowd didn't split for you, but it split for him right away. He got straight to Hajar al-Aswad. Who's this person? He says, I don't know who he is. Farazdaq was there. Again, the philosophy, the logic, the truth caught fire, and it became the words of Farazdaq that were enshrined. He says, وَالْبَيْتُ يَعْرِفُ وَالْحِلُّ وَالْحَرَمُ هَذَا التَّقِيُّ النَّقِيُّ هذا ابن فاطمة إن كنت جاهل. He says that you don't know who he is. He checked him right there. Farasdak did. He says this person, he says the haram know him. He says the ground you're walking on knows him. The bayt knows him. Everyone knows him. He says هذا التقي النقي. He's the son of Fatima. هذا ابن فاطمة إن كنت جاهل. If you don't know, recognize who he is. They imprisoned Farasdak. Farasdak went to the prisons. When they went to the prisons, when he went there, the news reached Imam Sajjad alayhi salam. When the news reached Imam Sajjad alayhi salam, he said, send this amount for him and also take care of him. At that point in time, a messenger went to Farasdak, and at that point in time, they said, Imam has sent this amount for you. At that point in time, he says, I did not do this for any money. I said these words of poetry because they were the truth. He says, ask the Imam, if possible, he can give me his shirt or some blessing, a scarf from him. That will help me in the hereafter. And he says, take the money back. The messenger went back. When he went back at that point in time, we're told, this is the fourth Imam's time. He says the Imam alayhi salam gave him the gift that he asked for because that would help him in the hereafter. And he said, we Ahlul Bayt, once we give something away, we never take it back. A principle that the Ahlul Bayt are saying. Because many people ask, oh, in these majalis, should there be, should this be going on? The same issue was going on during the time of the Imam alayhi salam. The answer can be said that the person who's reciting may not want to demand, because you have to have the akhlaq of Farasdak. But at the same time, the Imam's leading a principle that there's a value in what that person's doing, tremendous value, and it must be honored. Nonetheless, at that time, this was Farasdak, the poet of the era of the fourth Imam. Who was the poet who was in the era of the fifth Imam? The poet in the era of the fifth Imam was by the name of Kumayt al-Asadi. Kumayt al-Asadi was that poet that Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam, he had written a qasida in honor of the Ahlul Bayt and poetry and lines in honor of the Ahlul Bayt. Imam Baqir is in the vicinity of the Kaaba. When he's in the vicinity of the Kaaba, he turns towards the Kaaba and he raises his hands 3 times. Imagine if the Imam says this for one of us. Allahu Akbar. He says, Allahumma arham Kumayt. Allahumma arham Kumayt. Allahumma arham Kumayt. May Allah have mercy on Kumayt. May Allah have mercy on Kumayt. May Allah have mercy on Kumayt. 3 times. 3 times the Imam alayhi salam says this. That means the honor and the dignity. We're told Kumayt himself at one time was imprisoned for writing in honor of the Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam. When he was in prison, the Imam also, like his father, sent money to Kumayt. And at that point, when the money got there, at that point in time, we're told that he said that I did not do this for any wealth of this world. I did this and I said what I said for the Ahlul Bayt because it's the truth. The same thing happened. He says, I want the shirt of the Imam. One of the shirts. Why? Because when I'm buried, I want to be buried with it. Same thing happened. He said, we don't take back. And he gave the shirt. This was the philosophy of the scholars. We go further during the time of the sixth Imam. In fact, we have in traditions, authentic traditions, that the fifth Imam and the sixth Imam in their universities in Medina, they actually used to train poets themselves. That is, that the answer is getting clearer and clearer for us. Why? If it was a problem, why would the Imams themselves teach it? Nonetheless, sixth Imam, who was it? It was Sayyid al-Himyari. Remember these names. Sayyid al-Himyari was that person who wrote extensively in honor of the Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam. And he wrote qasidas, he wrote fadail, and he wrote many other lines of poetry. We're told there's a moment in time where Sayyid al-Himyari is on his deathbed. Sayyid al-Himyari was someone who was fair complexion, the traditions say, and he was a handsome man, even in elder age. They say he was on his deathbed. Now, look at the writer in honor of the Imam. There's no perfect person on this planet except the Imam. There's no saints. And people make mistakes. But remember, there's always the door. Like Khur's door was open, there's always a door open. We need to remember that. That the poet says, Har aane wale hur ke liye ye rasta khula rahe. That is this door of Aba Abdullah. It doesn't matter if you've been sinning and in vice, that door is open for you and I the same way it was open for Khur. Sayyid al-Himyari was someone, they say he had good and bad characteristics. Nonetheless, on his deathbed, there were people who had love for him and people who had animosity towards him. Both were surrounding him. When they were both surrounding him, they saw that a dot appeared on the forehead of Sayyid al-Himyari, the poet of the sixth Imam's era of the Ahlul Bayt. This dot began to expand and expand. It began to cover his face. The people, when people have enemies, they began to smile and they began to get happy. He said, I knew he was a bad person. He wasn't a good person. The same way that Mukhtar as-Thaqafi, people afterwards, after Karbala, they said, was Mukhtar good or not? Was he doing it for personal interest or not? Every era and every time, the companions of the Imams had to go through this themselves. That people said, oh, he had another interest. He had vested interest. He was not a good person. Good. So when this is happening with Sayyid al-Himyari, he looks towards Najaf and he says, Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen, is this how you treat your servants? Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen, is this how you treat your servants? Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen, is this how you treat your servants? And he said it from the bottom of his heart, the way a poet, the heart, when it explodes from the heart. At that moment, in the tradition, it says very clearly, at that very moment, his face, that dot and that darkness began to condense and it began to disappear from his face. And the light that illuminated it from his face was second to none. This is what the Imams do for their poets. A tradition from our sixth Imam. Imam alayhi salam, in an authentic tradition that you will find from the scholars of Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam, he says to his companions that if there's anyone who writes a 50 people and makes them cry, فَهُوَ فِي الْجَنَّةِ, that person will be in paradise. The Imam doesn't stop there. No. He says not 50 people, 40 people. He said no, not 40, 30, 20, 10. Imam says one person. You write it, compose 2 lines of poetry in honor of Ahlul Bayt, and you recite it, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who is Arhamar Rahimeen, will bestow that person. Imam says will be in Jannah. With respect to the weeping and the tears, the Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam have told us that the one who cries, who recites the musibah, makes 50 people cry. فَهُوَ فِي الْجَنَّةِ. No, 40, 30, 20, all of the way up to 1. Not only that, even if you can only make a... Why this emphasis on Karbala? Why this emphasis on Ashura? When we go further, when we go to the time of the 8th Imam, who's the poet? Da'bal al-Khidai. Da'bal recited the very famous lines in front of the 8th Imam. He says those lines that are still recited till this day. أفاطمة لو خلت الحسين مجدلا وقد مات عطشانا بشط فرات أفاطمة كومي يا ابنة الخير وأندبي. That these lines of poetry that Da'bal recited, that Fatima, if you were in Karbala, what would you see? That your Hussein, he died by the Furat without any water. Eyes of Fatima and cry for your son Hussein. That if you're in Karbala, you would slap your cheeks